moving occasion for me too. I'm actually deeply moved, and it shows. I've had the rare privilege, of having studied with Hannah for 3 academic degrees and beyond. I'm now one among many, but I was one of the first to have studied for so long with her. And my life has been marked by this encounter in such a way that I can talk of a before and a since the moment my trajectory crossed hers. What I just said is a synecdoche. For the history of the department, too, and this has been said before, but is worthy of iteration, especially today, the history of the department can be divided into what was before and what has been since Hannah's arrival on the scene. Predicates and attributes of the common academic lexicon, we've heard those, but for me, they cannot do justice to the transformative effect her presence has had. The glow and the splendor with which she marked our corridors and classrooms and offices, and many of our personal lives. And these are the index, some of us know, of a decided desire. Those characterize her. Hannah chaired the department for 8 years, perhaps the longest term any one person ever, and has in more ways than I can say made the department what we are proud it now is. I'll say more but later. But for now, I would like to cite the words of someone who was the administrative assistant who worked alongside Hannah during those years she was chair, Evelyn Milo. I'm not sure she's here, but these are her words. Anyone who worked with Hannah or was her colleague, Evelyn wrote, found themselves enriched with incomparable contents and qualities and a striking singularity. One of the great gifts Hannah gave the department was the people she brought to it. Some of them will be the highlights during this day. These are people who were drawn to her because of the splendor of her mind and person, and through her came to enrich us as colleagues and guests. So I would like to now introduce one of them, the cherished friend of the department for many years, Professor Marilyn Reizbaum. Marilyn Reizbaum is Harrison King McCann Professor at English at Bowdoin College and renowned scholar of British modernism and post-colonial studies. She's the author, most notably, of Joyce's Judaic Other, and the editor of Ulysses and Gendered Perspectives, and of very important works on Irish and Scottish literatures. Her current project is a monograph on Muriel Sparks' style, The Aesthetics of Ridicule. The title of her keynote lecture today is Dublin, Tel Aviv, New York, City Notes, Mapping a Friendship. I'm delighted to invite Professor Marilyn Reizbaum to speak.
Thanks, Shirley. Okay. That's it. Okay. Shirley, thank you. I'm really honored to be here. I'm so happy. Thank you, Tel Aviv University, for inviting me, the English department, and particularly Shirley and Milette, so much. I'm so happy to be here. So, I guess you can tell from my title that there is a very personal dimension to this talk. Well, how else could it be? For those of you who know me and Hannah, it's clear. We have known each other for more than 30 years, and our friendship is a web of connection, of language, backgrounds, friends, one that you can map geographically by the cities mentioned in my title, but also intellectually by the concepts that mark the mutuality of our work. It is as much a literary map as a personal travelogue that is constituted by these landmarks. That they are cities is important. Chana's 1995 book, City Codes, whose title I riffed on here, participated in and on the cusp of a critical trend that is ongoing: literary and cognitive mappings, urban, cosmopolitan, diasporic, and transnational. Reading space, formally, figuratively, and historically. Ways of opening out a field like modernism, expansive in its aesthetics, but seemingly insular in its national formations. In what follows, I'm going to do some tracing of these trajectories. In Joycean terms, I would say it's a commodious vicus of recirculation, and for those of you who know what I'm talking about, and just I think recirculation is the word to kind of light on there. I'll begin where we did in Dublin, well, more or less. I think it should be Copenhagen, but Dublin in earnest. Then Tel Aviv, the most extensive of our nodal intersections, and finally New York, where in the Golden Elant, all roads lead. Now, I don't care what they say about that in Kansas or Nebraska, where, by the way, I was born, and that's a long story. Okay. All are, to different degrees, homes away from home, testing an idea that Chana forwards about David Shirley in Henry Roth's Call It Sleep. For instance, that we might be illiterate in the language of home, while proficient in many other languages, even while, and maybe dafka, why, we are English professors. This tracing is circumscribed by time certainly, so, and counting. In the Atlas of the European Novel, Franco Moretti writes that geography is an active force that pervades the literary field and shapes it in depth. A map is precisely a connection made visible, he writes. This was in 1998, and with that book, looking forward to the digital humanities, Moretti began to change our sense of what is meant by literary landscape. How is it, he asks, that geography shapes the narrative structure of the European novel? That's a big question, but with Chana's help, I'll attempt to take a few peeks. So, for example, if I were to think of such landscapes in a more traditional sense, I might consider a map of the birthplaces of famous writers in Ireland, let's say, or locations of settings of famous works in England, like Dorset. But what about drawing the map of James Joyce's Dublin, famously recreated by him for posterity, he said? And how will that tell you something about the shape of the novel? We can go to the obvious modernist metaphors, the windiness, the narrative blind alleys. An increasing sense of mobility is afforded by the metropolis, and yet is checked by social, political, etc. forces. As Chana describes it about Singer's pre-war Warsaw, created in the family Muscat, historical hindsight erects phantom barricades along the very streets that are inscribed in the book to represent freedom of movement. There she includes a map of the Warsaw Ghetto, a symptom from the future of this city of Singer's novel, which predates the Holocaust. That map is a reminder of how the reconstruction of what has been lost must also be a double recovery of that loss, one that shapes the novel through the idea of access and its lack, even to the novel itself. The kind of mapping that modernist studies has done in the last several years has opened up geographical and cultural channels. For example, scholars have located the origins of Pound's catch-all modernist slogan of "Make it new" in an obscure Chinese phrase or motto, which bespoke recyclings rather than departures. They conclude thereby that the role of novelty in the development of aesthetic modernism is distorted, and the nature of novelty is itself simplified. That, ironically, Pound's landmark edict to make it new was a historical palimpsest, the conceptual opposite of erasing the past. Dublin. Dublin is one of those cities that exponentially complicates the idea of home away from home. As Hannah puts it, Dublin's dwellers are outsiders by virtue of being Dubliners. She calls it absence of sufficient urbanism, because it is marked by paucity, a pretense to being a metropolis. And yet in the 19th century, some claimed Dublin the empire's second city. In 1991, the year before Joyceans, including Hannah and I, converged upon the city for the James Joyce Symposium, Dublin was elected the European City of Culture. So in this way, too, in its very identity as an urban capital, Dublin is schismatic. This is Hannah and I'm taking the picture, with other Joyceans taking the Dublin Joyce tour. Joyce wrote about, I won't get into all of them, but Fritz sent many people there. Okay. Joyce wrote about Dublin as a self-imposed exile in Trieste, Zurich, Paris. In Ireland, he was an exile at home perforce. Quoting Joyce, as it were, from an earlier essay he had written in 1903, Little Chandler of the story A Little Cloud in Dubliners famously opines, if you wanted to do anything, you had to leave Dublin. Little Chandler not only opines, he pines. To move, and at once inclines to stay put. Hannah talks about the characters in Joyce's Dubliners as transformed into strangers, passers-by, faces in the crowd. And this is key to understanding much work in the Irish context, where being at home historically is always subject to the processes of estrangement, and yet where the wish to become a stranger is both a chronic condition and marks a perpetual state of displacement. One continues to be, as Hannah observes through her epigraph by Julia Kristeva to the Joyce chapter in City Codes, a stranger to oneself, or perhaps all too familiar. The trope of the exotic in Dubliners, and in Joyce generally, is a mirroring device, a longing for something less common, in both senses of that word. That is, to be less familiar and to ennoble the stranger that is the self. The longing for home or escape from it is often rendered through a window or window shot. Hannah discusses what she calls the built environment, the various roles that windows and doors perform, opening out to myriad possibilities and dangers, and more a metaphor than a means of egress or access. Windows and doors, even walls, make the metropolis legible, she says, by multiple acts of imagination. So here is how Eveline, in Joyce's Dubliners, begins. She sat at the window, watching the evening invade the avenue. Her head was leaned against the window curtains, and in her nostrils was the odor of dusty cretonne. She was tired. It does not sound good. But what's unclear, apart from Eveline's motives in rejecting her means of escape in the form of her beau Frank with passage to Argentina, is what's making her so tired. Is it what's inside the window or outside? Another example of a famous opening in this light may be found in Araby, a story of pubescent romantic fixation. North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street, except when the Christian boys' school set the boys free, when the Christian boys' school set the boys free. This too is ominous, but also a narrative signpost. Such modernist stories famously begin in medias res, but here the blind street is a tip about the narrative cul-de-sac to which such work seems to lead us. We have to find an alternative way around, one that will not conform to a conventional way of reading. One might argue that Ireland and Israel have been similarly fraught by the national imperative. In recent considerations of a more global modernism, it has been observed that the circulation of aesthetic modernist discourse through and between colonial cities and metropoles created a virtual cosmopolis where the global and the local were played out in the space of the urban culture. Some point to the example of Tagore within Indian modernism, who framed the experimental forms used in poetry and visual art within the Indian context. As Tagore wrote, "Whatever we understand and enjoy in human products instantly becomes ours, wherever they might have their origins." Tagore's contacts with both Jews and the Irish regarding the subject of nationalisms is well known. Joyce's work has been the site of such debates where, for instance, Gabriel Comroy's famous vision at the end of the dead is read variously as a treatment of national or cosmopolitan longing and belonging. And I'm going to get back to the dead in a little while. Joyce said Dublin was the center of paralysis, but he also admired it for its glamour and charm. Certainly he wrote about nothing else. Some might doubt the sincerity of that statement, especially in Dubliners, given its often grim reflections in the highly polished mirror Joyce said he was holding up to his fellow denizens. You can't quite call them citizens in this colonial city. Though he wished to provide a final caress, his word, in that last story, The Dead, rather than the characteristic harshness of his other portrayals in Dubliners, he admitted that his admiration for the city was twisted by the mischievous spirit of his pen. Tel Aviv. I cannot imagine this city without Chana. It is the locus of my physical situation within the city. And of course, the proximity of her home next to the university makes that all the more true. On a street that was called Mishmeret, when I first went there, and then changed to Motagur, a change I did not like because it was not euphonious. And I knew nothing of Gur's military history, the phrases that made him famous. Mishmeret may have a softer sound and a meaning of safety that I associate with the comfort of being in Chana's home. But its actual translation as night watch or changing of the guard, in this case of street names, makes me think of a passage in Ulysses where Leopold Bloom thinks, "Citiful passing away, other citiful coming, passing away too, other coming on, passing on. Houses, lines of houses, streets, miles of pavements, piled up bricks, stones, changing hands. This owner, that. Landlord never dies, they say. Other steps into his shoes when he gets his notice to quit. Piled up cities, worn away age after age, pyramids in sand, built on bread and onions, slaves, Chinese wall, Babylon, big stones left." Bloom thinks it, but it is Joyce's sensibility about the monumentality and therefore unthinkable ephemerality of cities. Of course, I had spent many years before 1994 in Israel as a student at Hebrew University and as a visitor, but then I was not a city dweller. You might say I was a Yerushalmit. Okay, but Jerusalem is not ha'ir. Sorry, everybody. I know it's Yom HaYerushalayim. I'm so sorry about that. Okay. The hub of my pre-Chana Israel was Netanya, the home of my aunt and uncle, my home away from home. In fact, by inviting me after Dublin and welcoming me to TAU, first in 1994, Chana be'etzem natna li maftachot ha'ir, gave me the keys to the city, which is the title of the Hebrew translation of city codes. These were keys that opened and continue to open doors for me here, to her family, and to the many friends and colleagues right here in this room. Oh, sorry, that's St. Stephen's Green. But this is city codes. Chana identifies several aspects of the cityscape that appear in the narratives of the authors she explores there. She deems them literary strategies for the representation of the metropolis in fiction. They make up the narrative of my encounter with Tel Aviv. Another example of such an aspect is the natural environment, which is the inclusion or intervention of nature into the built environment and is never outside the bounds of that built environment. This is the English cover. The cover photo by Agnes Danes beautifully images this phenomenon of the natural environment. You might say she takes it on. Danes of the ecological art movement titles her photo Wheatfield, a Confrontation, signaling what she sees and has become the showdown between globalism and environmentalism. One wonders what is encroaching on what here. The wheatfield seems feisty. The verbal environment is another such aspect. The written and spoken language, names of streets and places and other language inscribed into the cityscape. On my way to Mishmeret, then Motagur, I would walk up Tagore, which becomes the famous actor Raphael Klatchkin. I would often ponder how that happens so suddenly. Shylock is a pub at Masaryk, a testament to a Tel Avivi cheekiness, a freedom to tinker with type, a kind of affront to a history of vilification, which nevertheless cannot help but invoke it. And speaking of assaults and cheekiness, here is an example of the human environment that Chana speaks about that constitutes setting. And here they are, fanning the flames with Ulysses. See. Did you know that Chana loves the cold? The barren autumn trees? This is a picture of me at my office window in Maine, sent to Chana as a birthday card. Such sights you can see in Tel Aviv, mostly in the painting of Europeans, migrants, olim, such as Yecheskel Streichmann, and others who sometimes insinuated the European urban landscape into their artistic imaginations of Tel Aviv in acts of nostalgia or coping. This is Streichmann's painting, Fruit on the Windowsill, Perot al Edan Chalon. It is a late painting by him, but very much in the style of his work, modernist, what was called New Horizon lyrical abstraction. Speaking of viewing the outdoors through acts of estrangement, here the view outside is doubly removed, since it appears that the other building, the trees, and the skitty cityscape are all of a blur, viewed spectrally through the mirror around which the flowers are laid. The view is conflated with a missing image of the self, Streichmann's Tatzpit, his vantage point. There is no snow here, but Tel Aviv is still coming into view. The watermelons seem perched on the threshold between the two spheres. So Chana loves autumn and snow, and I love heat. These are emblems of what we are missing when we are at home. New York. Chana has written about Isaac Bashevis Singer, but in Warsaw. While one might argue, even regarding the story I'm about to discuss briefly, Warsaw is always the geographical condition of Singer's writing. This story takes place on the Upper West Side of New York, the part of the city that I most identify as part of my relationship with Chana, near her alma mater, Columbia, We would meet and eat at 70th Street, Café Luxembourg, at Nice Matin, at 77th Street, at Le Monde on 112th Street. This was taken at Nice Matin, and Aryeh, you're in this picture too, on 76th and Broadway in 2013. Singer's story, The Cafeteria, ostensibly takes place on the Upper West Side, though in the opening paragraph and throughout, in the realm of the imagination, a more global Jewish geography converges on the Upper West Side, the lost cities of the local inhabitants who are lost like them in this new home. I meet there the landslide from Poland, as well as all kinds of literary beginners and readers who know Yiddish. The moment I sit down at a table, they come over. Hello, Aaron. They greet me, and we talk about Yiddish literature, the Holocaust, the state of Israel. And those who were here last time eating stewed prunes and already in their graves. And then I have been moving around in this neighborhood for over 30 years, as long as I lived in Poland. I know each block, each house. There has been little building here on Uptown Broadway in the last decades, and I have the illusion of putting down roots here. In the story, the narrator, Aaron, a working writer, meets an attractive woman, also an immigrant and survivor, who becomes his touchstone for an understanding of his displacement and even disembodiment on the Upper West Side. When the woman confides in him that she has seen Hitler meeting with his henchmen in the cafeteria, one that has recently burned down, and assumes she has gone mad, the narrator tells her this: the past is not lost. An image from years ago remains present somewhere in the fourth dimension, and it reached you just at that moment. Singer, always funny, however drolly, and however much with a touch of the macabre, has produced the vision with a touch across time and across continents. Hitler and the others are wearing white robes, though these Klansmen look like doctors or orderlies. The woman responds to the narrator's assessment with, "As far as I know, Hitler never wore a white robe." The narrator's immediate response is to be worried about being tainted by Esther's madness. He is drawn to her, but also repelled by a fear that she is a kind of phantom. She is Gehenna, she tells him when they have a first fiery kiss. But when he thinks about it a year later, he muses. At first I thought it was utter nonsense, but now I began to reappraise the idea. If time and space are nothing, more than forms of perception, as Kant argues, and quality, quantity, causality are only categories of thinking, why shouldn't Hitler confer with his Nazis in a cafeteria on Broadway? She was not insane. She had caught a glimpse of the phenomena. He decides not to rest until he knows for certain what has happened to Esther. And the point there is that he keeps being distracted from that purpose with the business of life, or maybe the wish not to know. The characteristic supernatural dimension of Singer's work is what Morris Dickstein calls metaphors for the modern world, that Singer turns into typical modernist fascination with the unconscious, with the psyche, with the irrational. Of course, irrational. I foresaw, the woman says, Esther, you would give me this kind of explanation. When he rationalizes, paradoxically, that it was a vision, a glimpse of the past, when it is in fact a symptom from the future, or future anterior, in that the robes worn by the figment destroyers of the world they left are the apparel of their contemporaneous counterparts in the world to which they have come, the Ku Klux Klan. There is no complete escape from the fires. Singer said that his only hope was to come to America, that he foresaw there would be no rest in Poland, that he foresaw the Holocaust. But despite his pleasant peripatetic life on the Upper West Side, the story tells us that he did not foresee the no rest from the past that would follow him. The story itself is forged by the perambulatory rhetoric in Michel de Certeau's term, except here what walks are the ghosts of the history that has created this enclave. The locus is the cafeteria, but the story flits in time, in space, and between the conventions of the real and the surreal. And after all, the cafeteria keeps disappearing. It burns down, it reopens, it closes. The neighborhood changes. North Richmond Street was blind to the fact that Joyce had lived there. Nelson's pillar has been blown up. Mishmeret becomes Motegor. Krachmalna up Bashevis' street in Warsaw, which he said he seemed always to return to. Krachmalna becomes Isaac Bashevis Singer Boulevard, West 86th between Broadway and Amsterdam. Restlessness is the condition of the urban terrain, and the modernist one. And while it does not characterize my relationship with Hannah, the notion of restlessness does, as does our history. We too would sit in cafes on Broadway and elsewhere, and something like those in Singer's cafeteria talk of Yiddish, the Holocaust, and the State of Israel. I remember that Christmas we spent in a cafe on Broadway, where it was uncanny and discomforting. There seemed to be so many Esthers there, who in the story ages before the narrator's eyes. A strand of gray hair falls over her forehead, and how strange, the fur hat, too, seemed to have grayed. Singer's haunts are no longer there, but as Adam Kirsch suggests, we can honor him by walking up and down Broadway, eating and feeding the pigeons. We can also walk on the street with his name. Some piece of him is preserved, but perhaps the whole West Side has been given posterity through his story, which makes visible the ghostly outlines. Toward the end of the story, the narrator sees Esther for the last time with a man who is so much her senior that he muses on the veracity of his own encounter. Do corpses walk around on Broadway? This would mean that Esther, too, was not living. I raised the window shade and sat up and looked out into the night, black, impenetrable, without a moon. A few stars ran along with the train a while, and then they disappeared. A lighted factory emerged. I saw machines, but no operators. Then it was swallowed in the darkness, and another group of stars began to follow the train. I felt confused and shaken. I was turning with the earth on its axis. I was circling with it around the sun and moving in the direction of a constellation whose name I had forgotten. Is there no death, or is there no life? Could he be thinking about Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters as they are known, who the astronomers tell us are a family cluster, or maybe Orion, whose biblical name is Nephilim, who are the children of God before the flood? Perhaps most important here and throughout the story is the narrator's capacity for forgetting, in a good way, perhaps because it's self-sustaining. And one can almost hear, at least I have to make this connection, Gabriel's cosmic vision at the conclusion of Joyce's The Dead, where the famous chiasmic snow, faintly falling and falling faintly, which I have always read too as an act of forgetting, because as Gabriel discovers, remembering may be too painful. In that last view, Gabriel too raises the shades, as it were, shades in the sense of flickering existences, past and future, though, as I have argued, that makes him no less blind. The urban landscape he sees from the window, the now, is blanketed by an impossible general snow all over Ireland. It is overridden by the national vision, the monuments, the way names of generals or writers, the stars, occupy the ground on which we walk. Joyce famously said he would safeguard Dublin against its destruction by recreating it on the pages of his work exactly. Singer, too, as Hannah points out, was engaged in archiving the city, not against the possibility, or as Joyce might have it, the probability of future loss, but motivated by its already tragic destruction, the déjà toujours of loss that modernism apprehends and records. As Hannah puts it, despite Singer's avowal to write as if, the community had never ceased to exist. Hindsight makes it impossible for the novel to reconstruct a world without traces of its destruction, without its historical failure, infiltrating its fictive present. Ulysses might be said then to embody a kind of traumatic earliness with respect to the events of 1914 to 18, exhibiting an array of pre-traumatic symptoms thanks to its anxious depictions and expectations of disaster, and above all, to the privileged retrospective of its author. And that's a quote from Paul Saint-Amour. Its expectation of disaster articulates an anticipation that explains the seeming obsession with archiving Dublin. Walking these cities, we grieve what is no longer there, but we celebrate the writer and the works that contain them, what is and will always be. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn, for a very moving and usually dazzling talk.
It's a pleasure.
We have some time for questions if you want.
That's a hard one to follow right there, I would say. But I'm happy to answer any questions. There's a lot of Joyce in there, and for those of you who don't know Joyce's work, I apologize, but I hope it made you want to go out and read some.